Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to El Mugdav for this one. Amy plays Mind Control, targeting Nick's Doomwake Giant. When the Mind Control enters the battlefield, does this cause Doomwake Giant's ability to trigger? If so, whose creatures will get -1/-1? Alright, so in order to answer this question, we're first going to need to know a couple of facts about how triggered abilities work. Anytime anything happens in the game is going to check to see immediately after that event happens if any triggered abilities have triggered. And when it does that check, the game does take into account any continuous effects that happen to exist at that point. So let's take a look at what would happen immediately after the Mind Control has entered the battlefield. When that occurs, the game is going to check to see if any triggered abilities have triggered, and it's going to take into account any continuous effects, in this case Mind Controls, when it's determining how those abilities work. So, immediately after the Mind Control has entered the battlefield, it's attached to the Doomwake Giant. There is no point in time where the Mind Control is on the battlefield and its continuous effect is not applying to the Doomwake Giant and putting it under Amy's control. Accordingly, what that means is that immediately after the Mind Control has entered the battlefield, Amy controls a permanent that says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you get this constellation trigger. With that being the case, we can say that Amy will have a trigger from the constellation ability of the Doomwake Giant, and that's going to cause all of Nick's creatures to get -1/-1 after that happens. Now, there was one other situation I wanted to talk about because I think it has kind of a similar flavor, and I got reminded of this ruling when I was doing the research for this question. So let's say that Amy has a Doomwake Giant, and she uses an Arbiter of the Ideal to put a Grizzly Bears onto the battlefield. Would that cause the constellation ability to trigger? And this is kind of an interesting one, because if you take a look at how the Arbiter of the Ideal is worded, it's kind of an unusual template. You can see that it puts the Grizzly Bears onto the battlefield with a manifestation counter on it, and after that it says that the Grizzly Bears is an enchantment. So the thing that's kind of interesting here is that, well, if you were to ask a bunch of people what they thought was happening and base a ruling on that, then I would bet that most of those people would say that an enchantment was entering the battlefield under Amy's control. But the weird thing is that ordinarily in a game of Magic, sentences or discrete clauses are what the game uses to convey separate game instructions. And so what that means is that usually if you were to see something that was written out and it had two sentences, like what you see on the Arbiter of the Ideal here, then that would mean that you would perform the instructions in the first sentence first, and then after that you would perform the instructions in the second sentence. So if that was the case, then that would mean that you put the Grizzly Bears onto the battlefield first, and only after that does it become an enchantment. Now, that's kind of unfortunate if that were the case, because when the game checks to see immediately after the Grizzly Bears is put onto the battlefield, it's not going to see that an enchantment has entered the battlefield. Rather, the Grizzly Bears only becomes an enchantment in a separate step, and therefore after it has entered the battlefield. So which of these two interpretations is the right one? And so with the rules that existed at the time these cards were printed, it turns out that the answer wasn't really well defined. So Wizards had to actually put a new rule into the comprehensive rules that explicitly handled this case, and you can see it on your screen right now. As you can see, this rule here clearly defines that with abilities that are worded like Arbiter of the Ideals, then you become an enchantment as part of the process of getting put onto the battlefield. And so what that means is that you would indeed get a constellation trigger if this situation was to come up in a game. Pretty cool trick, right? But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.